Hello there. Hello. We're going to be chatting about that topic that all of us letting agents seem to love to talk about at the moment, which is the beloved Renters' Rights Bill. Now, some of you may be thinking this is an opportunity. Some of you may be thinking this is absolutely terrifying. But whatever you think of it, it's not going away and it's going to be here pretty soon. And so we decided to bring on two of the top leading experts in this topic to give you their insider tips on what to do about the beloved Renters' Rights Bill. So first of all, we have David Smith here. Needs no introduction. Everybody knows who he is. We see him at all the conferences and all the industry events, and he's absolutely awesome when it comes to talking legal stuff. And he's going to be sharing all of his insights and knowledges about Renters' Rights Bill. And we also have the lovely Sophie Lang, who is a very vocal point on this as well. And as a more practitioner, she runs a very large letting agency down in Cornwall, and she is here to give her practical tips and elements on how she's going to be helping to implement this in her business as well. So we've got about 40 minutes and we've got a lot to talk through. So let's start off with some of the points. Now, Renters' Rights Bill, what does it mean to you, Sophie, as a practitioner, first of all? What do you see this as an opportunity? Do you see this as a challenge? What do you see this as?
I do see it as an opportunity. I think there was an initial, oh my God, this is a lot. But actually, for agents to show their worth to clients, this is where we can really shine. I think a lot of it isn't scary. There's once you look at it, there is ways and means to deal with things. And I think that you have to come at it from a really practical point of view. And it's more about reassurance to landlords, because the bulk of it is okay. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you're a good agent, then you shouldn't have to worry. You just need to change processes and you need to make sure you're doing things right. So I see it as an opportunity.
Yeah, so legislation really it's what makes us useful to landlords, isn't it, really? If there was no legislation, they wouldn't need us. So in that way, it can be seen as an opportunity. What about you, David? How do you see it?
Well, I'm always trying to be positive about these things. At the end of the day, changes in legislation are obviously great for lawyers. But like you said, compliance is the one thing that landlords increasingly need agents for. It's part of the drive to professionalize the sector. If you're a professional agent, then a professional sector seems like a good thing to me.
Absolutely.
If you're a bad agent, not so good.
No, this is true. Well, maybe hopefully it'll weed those out and just leave the good ones. That would be even better.
And that's kind of the point, though. I mean, the problem for a lot of landlords and agents is actually the other guy. Or gal, as the case may be, who's giving the sector a bad name. The government in itself talks about rogue landlords, but does openly admit the vast majority of landlords are doing their job properly. But the problem a lot of the time is that those really bad landlords are not being effectively removed from the sector because enforcement activity is too patchy, it's underfunded. And of course, that's not just fixable through legislation. That has to be fixed on the ground with activity. But this does go some way towards making a means or creating a mechanism to help weed out those bad landlords and agents who undermine the efforts of the kind of people who turn up to these webinars.
It's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes it feels like you're just regulating the people that are already following the regulation. And do you see this as a way to get rid of some of the more rogue landlords and or letting agents, as the case may be, Sophie?
I think rogue landlords are always going to exist. They're going to go under the radar. They're going under the radar now, so they're going to try and keep doing that. I think that the key to the new legislation is going to be enforcement. And as David's already alluded to, current enforcement on current rules are not great, which is extremely frustrating for us agents and landlords that are following the rules and, spending the money to spend the rules and fit compliance and doing a good job. Yet we seem to be the ones, being punished by new legislation. Considering a lot of the legislation that's coming in is in effect in other parts of legislation in some form or another. So yeah, it is a frustration. I don't think it's going to eliminate rogue agents because they'll always exist in some form, but I do think that it will make it harder for them to function.
Interesting, isn't it? It is going to be an interesting few months. I'm interested to see how this goes. Anyway, let's dive into some of the topics. Now, one of the big things that most people are talking about is it's the end of fixed term tenancies. Now, we've had a short tenancies as we know it for a good time now, and this is going to end, and we're going to be into just open-ended contracts. We're not going to have renewals anymore. We're not going to be able to bring contracts to an end. This is panic stations. Everyone's like, what's going to happen? David, how do you see this as in an environment, and what's that going to mean to our landlords? What's that going to mean to us letting agents? Is it as bad as it sounds? Is it terrifying that we can't get our tenants out if we need to? What does that mean? Do we all need to run for the hills?
Yeah, I think you have to have some degree of perspective on this. There are around 5 million tenancies in the UK, thereabouts. Each year, around 20,000 of those end up in possession cases in the courts, which leads me to suspect that the vast majority of landlords don't require to serve notice at all. And indeed, most statistics show that most tenants leave of their own volition after about 2.5 to 3.5 years, depending on where you are in the country. I think tenants might stay a little bit longer, but I don't think that it's going to really affect a lot of landlords that they can't use Section 21. A lot of the people who are going on about this, one, are failing to appreciate that there's other grounds for possession to cover the critical issues, like, for example, wanting to sell, and are kind of just making a fuss for the sake of making a fuss in some cases. Where I am concerned, and where this will be more complicated, is where things do go wrong. The courts are very slow, and I think will get slower. Landlords will need to present better quality evidence, although I see that again as a selling point for good agents, actually, who should be able to help with that. And it will be slightly more complex. But I think the point, and I always emphasize this, is that the fundamentals of the private rented sector remain sound. There are more people wanting to rent in most parts of the country than houses available for them to rent. So the law of supply and demand remains entirely on the landlord's favour, and there's no prospect of that changing. In fact, the Renters' Rights Bill is likely to make it better if landlords sell up, as people say they're going to. In fact, I mean, the ironic thing about all of this is it's quite possible that the government will achieve the opposite of its objectives and cause rents to rise in many cases.
It's interesting, isn't it, Sophie? And one of the things, I mean, obviously I'm a letting agent, you're a letting agent, and most people that serve Section 21s and most landlords that end tenancies do so because they want to sell, refurb, move back in. It's the perception is that it's used as a retaliatory eviction, but is that reality, Sophie?
In my experience, in my experience for 20 years, as every agent will tell you, they've never served notice for no reason. So the no-fault eviction, what they call it, is very irritating to us. It's quite grating and triggering. There's always a reason. And with the new Section 8 grounds, one of those reasons is the reason we give notice. It is generally arrears, the three big ones: arrears, moving back in, or selling. And there's now grounds for that. So issuing Section 21 it's not a worry to me. Actually, I know the media focused on the removal of Section 21 as the big thing, but to me that was the least worrying part of the whole bit of legislation. I mean, for me, the fixed terms, again, I don't see it as an issue with our residential tenancies. We're still lacking properties in the rental market. Tenants, if they need to leave, still need somewhere to go. And rents, I do foresee rents going up for other reasons. The bit of concern that comes in for me with fixed terms is more niche markets like the student market. Ideal in the student market down in Cornwall, and the removal of fixed terms does cause more concern for void periods for HMO landlords, and how we're going to manage that, and how we're going to be proactive in making sure those voids are limited, which will take us to do a lot more proactive things for the student market than it will. But residential, I'm not overly worried about that.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that fixed terms disappearing is a problem for landlords so much as the ability for student tenants particularly to give notice at any point is a problem for landlords. And I think, again, a lot of landlords are quite worried that they won't be able to get possession of their property to let to new students, but that's not particularly different from where they are now, actually. There's a new notice process that replaces the existing notice process. The problem, it seems to me, is rather more that you'll get a group of students who'll get close to the end of term, realise that actually they haven't got any classes for the next month and a half, don't have any exams, they might as well just leave.
Yeah, I think we'll find people that do room by room will find higher void periods. People that do students on joint ASTs, we've always done ours on joint ASTs, will find less because you'll need the whole, that you've got that situation with a whole group leaving rather than just one. But I do foresee a lot of ours, their exams finish in May, so they can go, right, we're off, see you later. And then we're not reletting to summer. So they'll have more gaps that they've never had before. So that's more of a concern. And also when we advertise the properties, a lot of agents will be advertising their properties next month because that's how the cycle has always run. But with the new rules coming in that you can't sign a tenancy 6 months before it starts, means that we have to be more careful about how it's marketed, when it's marketed, and also knowing that we'll have possession at the end, and the timing of that possession and what the void will be. We just have to have a lot more planning now in the student sector, which I think a lot of agents are not fully understanding at the moment.
Yeah, there's several interesting points that arise from that, I think, that are worth considering. Because, I mean, the first point is joint ASTs are interesting, because I sort of agree with you. But at the same time, the problem with joint periodic tenancies is any one tenant can give notice and it's binding on all of them. So what I worry about is where the group is fractured and one of them wants to leave and no longer, after a year of putting up with their dodgy cooking and poor quality cleaning, no longer is interested in their welfare. So I think that's a concern in some properties. But I think in other cases, of course, the group will move together, so it won't matter. But I think it also depends on what the university is like as well. I mean, some universities have quite a strong thing going on. So I don't see, for example, Oxford and Cambridge have a very strong thing going on after exams. So there's a lot less incentive for people to leave there. Other universities, not so much. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting is this point about using ground 4A and the notice part of it. I mean, the first point to bear in mind, of course, is it doesn't apply to tenancies that convert. So it doesn't matter what you do now. But then going forward, I'm not sure it matters, because I'm not actually convinced that the vast majority of landlords will ever need to rely on ground 4A any more than currently they rely on section 21. So in practice, I'm not so sure that it's worth actually altering. If you're able to get away with it and change the marketing dates and signing dates, then fair enough. But if it becomes too disruptive to your local market, I'm not convinced it's worth the effort.
One of the things that happened in Scotland a few years ago, and I know we're not here to talk about Scotland, but they lost their Section 33, which is the equivalent of our Section 21, and all this scary language of, we're never going to be able to get properties back. And there was a fear that people would start to rent properties for holiday lets, but actually rent them as long term and then give notice after a month, and it'd be a way of getting cheap short-term lets, so to speak. I mean, how has that materialised in Scotland? Do you have any knowledge on that, David, at all?
Yeah,
because it's very similar to what's happening here, isn't it?
Yeah, it was really good you got Sophie on here because yes, that did happen. But it wasn't so much that made people move. It was more about issues of rent control that made people jump out the sector and jump. But you've got to bear in mind that Scotland is only a weak comparator to England and Wales. Well, to England, Wales is the same thing. The entire Scottish population is small. Is about the size of Birmingham, and the entire letting sector is the same size as the letting sector in Yorkshire and the Humber. So it's microscopically small, and it's almost entirely focused around Glasgow and Edinburgh. And it's very easy for people in student lettings in Glasgow and Edinburgh to instantly convert their properties into short let and to let them pretty much throughout the year. Edinburgh and Glasgow, Edinburgh particularly, just simply doesn't get the wintry downtime that other parts of the sector get. Cornwall's quite a good, interesting countervailing example, because obviously there is a very good holiday let sector in Cornwall, but it's not so great in January. And so it's debatable whether you can easily convert your student let into a holiday let. You probably can, and you might well make enough that it's worth it. But you'll be potentially running vacant for long periods. And then, of course, coupled with this morning, of course, not this morning, but over the weekend, the Prime Minister is sitting talking about finally pulling their finger out and getting the short let register going, which is on the statute books. The consultation was all done. It was passed originally by Boris's government, but later through one of his replacements in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. So it's all there waiting for regulations to roll out. But what the Prime Minister also said, of course, is about this stage 2 where they're going to start introducing all additional planning controls and potentially more council tax. So if people are thinking about doing it, my advice is to get while the getting's good. Start using it now before the planning restrictions come in, so that you've established a use. But at the same time, I wouldn't say for sure that is the same option as it is in Scotland, where there's just a lot less restriction over short letting. It's not a big deal there.
We've got a question from a lady, Nicola Randall. Would you still proceed this year with a student let? A lot of agents may start the cycle this year as the bill is not yet law. So would you still proceed this year with student lets? Sophie, I'll put it over to yourself.
I mean, we kind of have to, because obviously it's a market that exists that still, and the universities aren't yet very much clued up on what's happening. Our local university was very shocked when I had a meeting with them to tell them what was happening, especially with the international students, because a lot of their intake is international students. So I think we kind of have to go, because we don't know when it's going to come in yet. I mean, David, I don't know what your best guess is of dates. I know April's being thrown around quite a lot. And what will be applied when, as in they're obviously were saying it's all going to happen on day one, and then retrospective to current tenancies, where we are. I think everything's a bit grey at the moment of exactly what's happening and how it will be implemented. I think we have to wait for that. I don't know what you think on that.
So business as normal in Cornwall then? Anything to add, David?
Yeah, I mean,
I
mean, to answer the question, I would proceed with the student if it makes economic sense for you. In terms of implementation, which is the implied in Sophie's answer, it's not clear. It goes back to the House of Lords on October the 14th is the current planned time, but that might change. Probably won't, but it might. And that then allows the Lords to put forward amendments again based on the ones that were rejected by the Commons. But that's only in a relatively small number of areas. I think some amendments will appear. It then goes back to the Commons for them to reject those amendments again, which they will do. And then it's up to the Lords whether they have another go. I don't think they will, which probably gets you royal assent around about November. The sector has been asking for 6 months. I'm not convinced that MHCLG will give you 6 months. 4 seems more probable, but 4 takes you to early March, 5 months takes you to early April, and the beginning of April is one of the traditional periods in the year when new legislation comes into effect. So I'm currently guessing on the beginning of April, basically. In terms of what comes into effect at that point, well, Section 21 removal is number one on the list. It's going to go. That's the first thing. Then beyond that, you're obviously going to have to get rid of ASTs and bring in the new grounds of possession at the same time. I would assume that the government will probably bring in the new tenancy agreement and also the new rent increase stuff and stuff about overbidding, all of which we can talk about. Things that will happen later, Awad's law, decent home standard, private rented sector database, redress schemes will all, I think, roll through probably by October-ish next year.
Let's talk about rent increases for a second, because
one thing before we jump out. The one thing that's very important is when this comes into effect, student landlords in particular have 2 things to do within a month. The first thing they have to do is to notify the tenants that they're going to rely on Ground 4A, because normally you have to notify tenants that you might rely on Ground 4A before a tenancy comes into effect. Obviously, on a transition, that you won't be doing it because you can't do it now. So you've got a month to do that. So they're going to do a lot of work there. And also, all landlords will have to give a prescribed notice that the government's going to produce, setting out for tenants how their rights are changing, and that's got to be done within a month too. So the main thing for all landlords to bear in mind is they're going to have to do a lot of posting, or agents to bear in mind, a lot of posting or emailing. And if you don't have an email service clause in your tenancy agreement, now would be your time. Within a month, when this stuff comes into effect, and also for student landlords, they've got to do the extra thing of saying Ground 4A will apply in this case. Okay. Sorry, now ask the question about rent. Sorry.
Great tip. That was a great tip. Thank you for that. So rent increases. Now, I just come back from holiday in France, and I was there with a landlord. I didn't know she was a landlord. She was chatting away. She said, "Oh, I haven't increased my rents for about 6-7 years now. Lovely tenants, don't want to upset them." And I'm like, panic. So really, what should we be doing? Because obviously we're not going to be able to really increase rents outside of these parameters. So talk to us as letting agents now. What should we be doing to protect our landlords with these rent increase rules that are coming in, the changes that are being made? Sophie, do you want to go first?
We've already been looking at our portfolio for the last over a year, and making notes of the ones that are well below. I mean, we've always been really proactive in this area, but we've done a lot of acquisitions of other companies in recent years, and they haven't been as proactive. And we have been targeting let-only landlords on the ones, because it is generally self-managing, because they just let the tenant roll, and they're like, it's fine, it's fine. We've been educating them on how it's actually detrimental to the tenant, because if they ever have to find a new property, they'll never meet the affordability criteria, and they'll be shocked at the difference in rental prices. Obviously, for them, if they ever want to sell it, it's not going to be worth on rental yields and things like that. It's never going to get its full potential. So we've done a lot of education in that field. So we have been working really hard for the last year on getting rents where they should be. So when it hits, ours will be quite manageable, as in on an annual basis, to do the full review, see where it is in relation to the market, and follow the procedure to do it. We got our team very much practiced and using Section 13 quite regularly. I know a lot of agents don't use Section 13; they've done it on renewal, so do it with agreement. But we've been getting the team already using Section 13, so they kind of know what the process is and provide some of the evidence already. But it will be a service for us. Again, this is an opportunity for agents to show our worth, our knowledge of the market, what the property should be, our knowledge on how to appraise a property and find the rental market value for it. And also it's a service that we'll be able to charge more for in when the legislation changes, because it is going to be a more in-depth process than it has been up until now.
So, David, what is the new process? What do we need to be aware of with these changes coming in?
Right. So as Sophie's alluded to, the only option will be to serve a Section 13 notice. You can't agree a new rent with a tenant. You can't rely on a rent increase clause, any of those things. You have to serve a Section 13. Once you've served a Section 13 notice, the tenant has 2 months, so up from 1 month, 2 months to appeal to the first tier tribunal. If they do so, then the rent won't increase, and the first tier tribunal will determine the rent, and it will then increase after the first tier tribunal has made its determination. So the problem here is that the longer the first tier tribunal takes to determine this, and it's longer than the government says, is the short answer, then the longer it will take before the increase comes into effect. So the fear factor for a lot of landlords and agents is that tenants will always appeal, because they'll get a delay. What's the worst case scenario? Because the tribunal can't increase the rent above the level on the notice, which is another change from now. So the worst case scenario is you'll pay the rent you're being asked for, but later. Now, there are some things that agents should be thinking about. One, are you charging for this service? If so, is it in your terms of business? If it isn't, you should be getting that in there now while the going's good. Two, anything in your current portfolio, I would be looking to increase the rent up to near the market level now, because it will be a lot easier now on a renewal than it will be through the Section 13 process later. Three, the first tier tribunal works heavily on comparable property. So it's really important to think about how you're going to provide your list of comparables. Now, for some agents, that's easy. If you're letting in a city and you have like an entire block of flats that are all rented out, comparables are simple. If you're somewhere like Sophie, which is a bit more rural, a bit more mixed, comparables are a lot harder to get your hands on. And the problem is that traditional sources of information like portals won't be such great evidence of comparability, because they will be bid prices, not what tenants are actually paying. And for reasons we can explore a bit, those will start to differ. So there are people producing products that will roll out products that are likely to work on this area and provide data. So you might need to think about whether you should take one of those products. And then the last point I would say is bear in mind that you can agree a rent increase as long as it's less than the amount on the Section 13 notice and is done after the Section 13 notice. So one option is to serve your Section 13 notice and then seek to agree the tenant some slightly lesser amount which you're prepared to accept in order to get it done. And I suspect in some cases that will be a way forward. I mean, and that also brings back the more traditional approach, because often, and I think the government's lost this point, a lot of rent increases tend to be negotiated. The landlord says, I want X. The tenant says, well, that's quite a lot. But look, I really want a new sofa and carpets. Get that done and we'll call it quits. Tenants have no incentive to make an agreement. They're better off to go to the FTT. But then landlords have no incentive to make an agreement either. Their incentive is to say, fine, stick with the crappy carpets and the moth-eaten sofa. Enjoy it. I'm still having an increase. Whereas a more sensible route forward would be to serve a Section 13, then approach the tenants and say, actually, look, this is the market figure. We've got comparables to prove it, but is there a deal we can do? Is there something that you'd like? And I notice, actually, because I regularly inspect this property, that actually it's looking a little bit tired. Landlord's not averse to giving it a bit of a repaint. Would you agree 90% of this rent? And as long as that agreement is then reduced to writing, it must be in writing.
I'm going to ask you, David, in comparison to other legislative changes, I mean, the tenant fee ban was a massive one. That was world changing. We felt like it was at the time. How do you see this renters' rights bill in a scale of change this is going to be for the industry?
Oh, huge. Certainly bigger than the Tenant Fees Act. Some people have said it's the biggest since the Housing Act 88. I wouldn't go quite that far. Certainly as big as the Housing Act 2004, which is tenancy deposit protection, HMO licensing, all of those things. Certainly as big as that. So pretty damn vast, frankly.
It is going to be big, isn't it? What about you, Sophie?
It goes into every area, It goes into agents' processes, landlords' processes, compliance. It has market effect. So it really just touches on every element of the process.
Sophie?
Yeah, I think like David said it really well. I think we've had lots of legislation, as we know, in the last 20 years. We've had more legislation than the previous, 50, but they've all been bits. They've been very specific. So Tenant Fee Act was a very specific piece of legislation. HMO was a very specific, your Gas Safety Section Deregulation Act. They were all specific about one part of the process, really. Whilst this piece of legislation touches every part of the business. It touches our front end, back end. Every process we do is affected by this piece of legislation. So as an agent, if you haven't already, which you should have been, already looking at your terms of business and what you do and your processes and everything behind the scenes, and already thinking about what you need to do, you need to rewrite your terms of business, you need to look at your fee structures, you need to look at how you service clients and what you offer, and you're going to have to go through every single bit, and that takes time. So you need to sit down and you need to be doing that and taking into effect, because the legislation as it currently stands, it's not going to change much from what it is now. I mean, I think there might be some like very small tweaks in wording and stuff like that, but as a piece of legislation, I think this is what we've got. So we need to start working now and making sure we've got things in place, because as David's already said, it's going to happen very quickly. It's not going to be like this is coming in a year. This is coming, early next year or mid next year after the first quarter. So, and you need to be ready to go. So yeah, as a piece of legislation, it is massive. It is massive, but I think if you're being prepared and you're doing what you need to do, it's not as scary as you think it is.
Interesting. Now, one of the things that I find really concerning about the Renters' Rights Bill changes is the lack of being able to take the money in advance, 6 months in advance, because the Renters' Rights Bill is all about making tenancy more accessible for all. And yet we all know as practitioners that we get so many people that have just landed in the country, have just started a new business, don't have credit rating, whatever the case may be. And their only access to getting a property is 6 months in advance. And yet now we're not going to be able to do that. So why, and what do we do? How do we help these people? So over to you, David. What do you think the plan is here, and how do we solve this or that particular market?
I mean, the government's the government's been pressed into a position where it's being encouraged to believe, rightly or wrongly, that landlords use large rent in advance claims as a means of screening out certain groups of people, and they're used unjustly or unfairly. And that's probably true to some extent, but it's also untrue to some extent. And this is not in the first area where this is a problem, but I think the government's in a serious danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because it's completely failed to bear in mind that in most places, most of the time, landlords have pretty substantial amounts of choice, and they're just not obliged to take people. The government's alternative solution with all of this is that that people will go for more guarantors, and what it has said, I'm not entirely convinced this is correct, but there they are, is that the new brood of professional guarantor schemes that are starting to appear are an acceptable solution. So things that people would want to bear in mind: one, any existing tenancy with a rent in advance provision can carry on using it throughout. So if you're signing rent in advance deals, people often sign them as 6 months, then going monthly. If you left them as 6 months and continuing 6 months, that would be acceptable under the Renters' Rights Bill. Although I should immediately caveat this by pointing out that 6 months rent in advance is not a mandatory ground for possession under Ground 8. It only applies to yearly, quarterly, or monthly or weekly rents. So you might need to think about that. You might have taken quarterly rent in advance than 6 monthly. You should look into, I've mentioned professional guarantor schemes, you should look into those. The other thing to bear in mind is that tenants can offer you an extra overpayment. So tenants can voluntarily pay more, but they can't do for the first month, only for the second and subsequent months, and it's got to be genuinely voluntary. You can't hold them to it. And the other problem with all of this is that if tenants do overpay the first month, they are in fact breaking the law, and so are you by accepting it. So you can't accept it, and the government says you have to give it back. That's not terribly practical in most cases. And then the last point to bear in mind about rent in advance is you also can't demand a rent payment prior to the signing of the tenancy agreement. So you've got to enter into the tenancy agreement before getting the first month's rent. Now, I've heard lots of people say, oh, well, I just won't execute the agreement then. But that's completely missing the point. If you haven't signed and executed the tenancy agreement, you haven't entered into it. So you can't have the first month's rent. So the reality is, in all cases, landlords and agents are going to have to sign agreements in the hope that the tenant then pays the money. And if not, they're going to have to give them the keys and let them into the property in arrears. And people haven't really got their heads around that point. Now, there are things you can do to mitigate this. A lot of agents take a holding deposit and then move in monies, which is basically the deposit and the rent all together. You don't have to do that. You can take the holding deposit, you can take the tenancy deposit before the tenancy agreement is signed, then sign the tenancy agreement and then demand the first month's rent. So if the tenant defaults, you've got a chunk of money being the holding deposit of a week's rent and the security deposit of 5 or 6 weeks' rent already. And of course, that will have shown they've got some money before you actually sign the agreement. The next thing that might be possible is it might be possible to put a clause in the agreement saying you have to pay. We're signing this agreement, say, 3 days in advance of the actual move-in date, and you have to pay the first month's rent. And if you don't, the agreement is voided. It's conditional on this, and we can terminate it. That might be a possible thing. That's going to end up in court, though. So if you want to do that, then you're running a risk. And then the third option is very careful referencing.
I mean, is it possible that companies might start to spring up where you could put money into sort of an escrow account or something? Or
that's just a different way of paying rent in advance.
Oh, it just sounds crazy. Again, I'm an agreement before they pay.
I'm being careful not to mention companies, some of whom are my clients, but there are people offering who have already adapted some of their landlord insurance products to deal with this risk better. So you might want to go and explore the market and look at what's around. But I can't name my clients. So there we go.
Yeah. Wow, God, that is terrifying. Sophie, how are you going to handle that? That's a horrible question.
Yeah, I know. I mean, bring it back to students. Obviously, students, there's international students who get government grants and things like that, and it is hard, and my concern is that tenants do not know this. I still have tenants who ring now offering higher deposits for pets because they don't know that we can't take a higher deposit. So tenants don't know a lot of the changes that are coming and that it affects them and what they do. So it's going to be very interesting, and it is hard for us to get our heads around, especially things like we have to give them the keys before the master. Try and explain that to your landlord who's like, well, I won't let them in. And it's like, no, you don't have a choice. I think there's going to be a lot of lonely landlords that get themselves in trouble.
I mean, that's a really good point, because, of course, bear in mind that comes under the Protection from Eviction Act. And under the Protection from Eviction Act, it's now much easier for local authorities to enforce it because they can issue a civil penalty for failure to comply with the Protection from Eviction Act on the agent as well. So there's an enormous problem, an enormous amount of understanding that needs to be achieved. If the tenant has signed the agreement but hasn't paid the rent, you've still got to let them in. And if you don't, they can go straight to the local authority, and the local authority gets to keep the fine money, which is up to £40,000 for that offence, if they come after you. So there's an enormous challenge there. But then I should think, just to be very clear, that is actually a very rare occurrence. I keep hearing people saying, what if the tenant does this? And my usual response to that question is, has this ever happened to you? And then they usually say no. And I say, has this happened to anyone you actually know? And then they usually start talking about having read a story on the internet. And I said, no, someone you actually know has actually had this. And they're like, oh, well, no. I'm like, well, in that case, it's clearly not that common then, is it? I mean, I accept it does happen, but you can't, people get run over. But I still cross the road, and obviously do so with some care. But you've got to operate within the risk parameters of the world, and you've got to have a degree of reality about it.
So let's talk about a few key things people should be doing now. What can we be doing to prepare for this? So we need to be auditing our terms and conditions, Sophie, you said. We need to be perhaps putting a process in place for dealing with pets, because I know that's another thing that's coming in, how we're going to be dealing with that. What should we be doing now, David?
Well, I would advise agents who haven't refreshed their terms of business to do so now. You should bear in mind that any landlord who's signing your terms of business now is still going to be a landlord when this comes into effect in a few months' time. So you need to make sure that your fee structure still works. Bear in mind, lots of agents rely on renewals to get fees. There ain't no renewals under the Renters' Rights Bill. All tenancies always were already periodic, so there's no renewal. So you need to make sure you've got a fee structure that works. You need to think about your additional liabilities and what they are and how they're defrayed. You need to think about all the other problems that go with the bill, and also Section 13 notices and all these things. You need to think about your fee structure, how you're going to make money. Some agents rely, for example, on a small chunk of money for doing a renewal, which is never going to occur. So admin around the renewal. So you've got to replace that with a Section 13 process. People should be thinking about educating themselves and making sure they really understand this stuff, because despite people humming and hawing, the bill is done. It's not going to change from where it was prior to various amendments the government kicked out. So people need to be getting themselves up to speed now. You won't have a lot of time, and a month of that will be Christmas, so that will be largely dead time. And Christmas is quite long this year as well, because of the way it falls. Most people just won't work right through until early January. So that's a substantial chunk of time gone from your prep time. And you need to make sure your staff are up to speed. Again, especially for a smaller agent, it's not you that's the problem. It's the staff member you don't trust and don't like that much, who does Saturdays. And I say this about lots of things, but you've got to bear in mind, the problem is not your strongest person; it's your weakest person.
Very wise words there, David. Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here today, David, and thank you so much for being here today, Sophie. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.